Gives me great pleasure to introduce Dan Dauwalter. Dan is with Trout Unlimited, which is one of the largest NGO organisations, volunteer angler-based organisations in America. They do some fantastic work, particularly around trout and particularly around environment. So we're really privileged to have Dan here, and he's going to give you an American perspective on a similar problem.
I'd like to start off first by thanking Fisheries Victoria for inviting me across. John Douglas has given me a good opportunity, as well as the Manfield boys, to get to see a bit of the country and a few of the trout streams that we'll hear about the rest of today. So sort of what I'm going to be talking about is a little bit of some of the issues that we see across the pond in the United States, but also sort of give you some perspective as to how our Trout Unlimited volunteers get involved in habitat restoration. And to do that, I'll give you a little bit of background for those of you that aren't that familiar with Trout Unlimited. So, like most of the clubs that some of you belong to in the room, Trout Unlimited was founded by a group of anglers in Michigan. There's a little reference here up in the corner that'll be there throughout the talk. So if you see a picture and you want to know about where that picture is from, that star will give you an idea. But George Griffin and a group of anglers met on the banks of the Au Sable River in Michigan, basically to form Trout Unlimited. It's an organization. They formed because of some discontent with the way the trout fishery was being managed. So there's probably some similarities here. In particular, in this case, the fishery was being managed primarily by stocking, and what they were concerned about was that they thought that stocking might be a band-aid over a larger issue surrounding habitat. This group of anglers really thought that the habitat should be healthy enough to produce the fish, and they wanted to see some of the management be focused on habitat management and restoring that river. The quote that this group used was they wanted to ensure that wild native trout thrive as nature intended, but also that if you take care of the fish, the fishing will take care of itself. And that's often done through taking care of the habitat. So restore the habitat, you have healthy fish populations. Needless to say, the fishing can take care of itself. The mission of TU is to conserve, protect, and restore North America's cold water fisheries and their watersheds. On the right there is a conceptual model in terms of how we operate both at the grassroots level as well as the staff level. Typically the headwaters of streams tend to have the healthiest habitat, maybe in a national park, crown land. In the States, it might be designated capital W wilderness. As you start to move downstream, you start to see more issues with water withdrawal, roads, fish passage barriers. A focus there is reconnecting that habitat. And as you sort of get into the lowland country, they start to become working rivers impacted by the myriad things that happen because of what we sort of require out of water resources. Today, TU has 417 chapters across the country that represent 150,000 plus members. Each chapter is organized under state councils, and the chairs of those councils ultimately move up into a national leadership board that develops policy and speaks to our board of trustees. And those volunteers across those 417 chapters contribute over 600,000 hours of volunteer work on an annual basis. And all of that work, again, is done to keep the habitat healthy, to keep the fish in the habitat, and keep the fishing good. To help support the volunteer base of our organization, we have now over 200 staff across the nation. Those staff do everything from working in Washington, D.C. on policy issues, volunteer operations, develop tools that allow our membership in our Trout Unlimited chapters to be as effective as possible. But we also have conservation staff that are trained in habitat restoration, and as part of that restoration, they use the help of our Trout Unlimited chapters. So they're sort of can often be the go-between between working with the agencies and focusing the energy of the chapters and helping direct them to do volunteer work that again has the best benefit to streams and rivers in the States. So sort of the theme of my talk and the theme of what will happen the rest of this session is things are changing on the landscape, not just here, but they are in the States as well. Some of those changes are similar to what you've experienced here. Some of them are a little bit unique, but they all influence stream and river habitat, trout populations, and fishing. So for most of you that have fished a long time, you know the fishing has probably gone up and down. And for those of you that work in the profession and have any sort of long-term data, you know that those data on trout populations go up and down as well. This is a classic data set from the Midwestern United States. It's a brook trout population. It represents the number of thousands of brook trout per hectare. It's a fairly old data set, but it's a classic one. And there's a couple different things that have gone on over the time period of monitoring here. One is that sometimes you have climatic events that are, in some cases, natural, like a flood that scoured out the stream bed when the eggs were in the ground. The population took a hit, but trout populations are resilient. The population came back soon after. The population took another hit from a big sediment slug due to a housing development. That habitat was restored. The trout population rebounded. Again, trout populations are resilient. As long as the habitat's there, they'll come back. And in this specific case, brown trout had moved in and basically displaced the brook trout. But the point being is that the trout populations are resilient, and they're often more resilient when the habitat's healthy. Even if it's natural disturbance, or in the case of any sort of human disturbance, the stream system's restoration can help improve the habitat and bring back the populations. So in the Midwestern United States, agriculture is big business. This photo represents a high level of erosion in the driftless area of the Midwestern United States. The driftless area is a small area around Wisconsin, southeastern Minnesota, northeast Iowa that was passed by the last glaciation, so there's not a lot of glacial till or glacial drift, therefore it's driftless. But it's often called coulee country, bluffland country. There's a lot of spring-fed streams, limestone streams, small, cool water streams that can produce big fish. But in the 30s, because the land was being used in such a way, it resulted in a lot of upland stream erosion. We had a lot of gullying. All of the sediment ended up in the valley floors of the larger river systems and some important trout fisheries. And it was really sort of the part of the United States where the conservation movement sort of changed how conservation agriculture was done, where there was large-scale implementation of contour farming, for example, buffer strips. So if you bring up Google Earth and you zoom around that part of the country, you'll see contour strips all over the place. And it's really helped to sort of protect or reduce the amount of erosion that's gone into streams. But the streams there have a legacy of this historical upland erosion. So one of the big focus areas of our Trout Unlimited chapters in this region, there's about 600 plus miles of small streams, small trout streams, and there's maybe 20, 25 different chapters that get involved in habitat work. Part of what they do and what they've experienced recently is high intensity rainfall events have become more prevalent in the last 10 to 15 years, has resulted in flooding, a lot of stream bank erosion. This is an example of a cornfield that there's essentially no buffer between the field and the stream, so you see a high level of stream bank erosion. Part of that was accelerated by flooding. But the chapters get heavily involved in habitat restoration work here, and this is just an example of a work day where the volunteers, I think it's a couple different chapters in this case, come together, help build some habitat structures that ultimately get incorporated into stream restoration in the region that's directed by our staff. So this is an example of a restoration project, and some of those longer structures are incorporated here, again, to arrest some of the erosion issues, improve the habitat. It'll benefit the trout populations, and the trout will come back. Healthy streams grow healthy trout. Now there's a couple things to note about these two pictures here. One, those are big brown trout. Two, they're two different trout. So you can tell that it's the same character, but he's wearing different clothes. If you look at the fish close enough, they're different fish. Three, I don't know why he's not smiling in here, but it might be because the fish is so heavy that he's having a hard time holding it up for the picture. And last, he won't tell you where he caught these fish, not surprisingly. Abandoned minelands are something else that we deal with in the States. This is an example from Pennsylvania. There's a lot of acid deposition. Some of the streams are highly acidic, and that's detrimental to native brook trout in the eastern United States. We have staff that are working with our volunteers to help fix these streams, in addition to working with the agency partners. In the West, there's been a lot of dredging and placer mining related to gold, for example. These pictures show some dredging and placer mining in Idaho City, which is just outside of Boise, Idaho, which is where I'm from. And you can see these old gold dredges that basically went up and down the valleys and basically turned the valleys upside down. If you look at the aerial imagery, you can see, for example, this whole valley floor consists of mine tailings. So they basically turn that whole valley upside down, but we have staff. This is a colleague that works in my office, Pam Harrington, who's worked since 2006 or 2007 to restore some of these streams. This is an example of a stream where they've taken down the tailings, rebuilt the floodplain to the historical level, incorporated some habitat structures in here. She's done a ton of plantings. You can tell that there's not a lot of mature riparian vegetation here. Willows are native in this part of the country. She's done a lot of planting, not only with Trout Unlimited volunteers, but she's done a great job of getting school kids out to help plant plants and help. Ultimately, the idea will be to help cool the stream and make it a much healthier trout fishery. It's not an easy place to dig to plant trees. And they're still smiling. So it's good to get the kids out. They get to get out of school, stick a shovel in the rocks, plant some trees, and have fun. Learn a little bit about the history of what happened there historically in terms of gold mining, but also how restoration works and how they can be a part of that process. We also deal with drought. Some of you have been across the last couple of years. It's been hot. We do deal with closures to trout fisheries in some cases. These are just two examples. Montana does formal closures when it gets hot and stream flows get low in the dry season. This map here shows some streams that were closed to fishing in 2002 in Yellowstone National Park. And these are in what most people would consider to be our iconic western trout fisheries. So even those are susceptible to changes in climate and periods of drought. So it really sort of begs the question of, do we really need closures, or in some ways should anglers sort of self-regulate? There's been the example you hear in some states that don't have formal closures is that they don't need them, and they think that if an angler is catching a fish or two and he sees that he knows the water's warm and the fish doesn't recover too well, maybe you should walk away and come back and fish another day when it's cooled off a little bit. So basically the anglers can self-regulate themselves. There's been a lot of discussion within Trout Unlimited about keeping fish wet. We all like to have the big brown trout up for photos, but that photo op shouldn't really take more than 10 to 20 seconds, because beyond that, it can be really stressful to fish. One analogy that I keep hearing is that when you're playing a fish, it's struggling. It's basically run a race, and when it gets to the end of the race, you're basically lifting it out of the water, depriving it of oxygen, and it's like running a sprint and then having someone put a bag over your head. So just think about that. There's the hashtag keep 'em wet effort, but really just be mindful. And there's been a lot of discussion of whether TU should have a formal policy, but keeping fish out of the water for a minimum period, and what the science has shown is about 10 to 20 seconds is fine, as long as you put them back and help them recover. Wildfire, otherwise known as bushfire, I believe, has been another issue. Typically by the end of the summer, late August in the States, you can look at the map, a fire map of the US, and you'll see fires burning in almost every state. This is a fire that was, I think in 2013, in the South Fork of the Boise River, again, just outside of where I live. A fire that denuded much of the landscape, and about 3 weeks later, we had a heavy rainfall. When you have heavy rainfall on unvegetated land, you can see things like this in your blue ribbon trout fisheries, where we have basically a small side tributary that blew out, basically blew across the road. This happened in several of these gullies. And again, this is a blue ribbon trout fishery, and we know that trout don't like to live in chocolate milk. So a lot of concern over this, including this is our local chapter's home river. It's the one that they put most of their effort towards. Obviously a big concern. It's an economic driver. It grows big fish. It's fun to fish. But our volunteers, energized around this effort, and one of the things that they did was try and revegetate some of these side gullies that if it continued to rain, without a little help, they would continue to dump sediment into the river. And so they organized a couple different plantings to sort of help revegetate and speed up the recovery process of some of these side gullies. Our local chapter does an annual fly fishing tournament. Basically, they have teams of people that pay money to go through a tournament and cast into hoops, etc. But this whole tournament is based around raising money towards restoration of the South Fork of the Boise River. They raise over $10,000 per year or per tournament, and all that money goes back into the river. One of the big projects that the chapter undertook was raising money to replace a perched culvert or a fish barrier on a tributary stream that had a lot of spawning habitat above it. They basically took that tournament money, leveraged it against some other funding sources, and replaced that culvert with a bridge that was a little more fish friendly, again opening up more spawning habitat. And these are just some examples of some of the pots of money that they leveraged. So there's a TU group sort of leading the charge. They got the 2 fly shops in town involved as well. The other fly fishing group, the Boise Valley Fly Fishermen, they got some money out of the big box store, worked with the local land management agency, which in this case is the Forest Service, as well as some foundations. So really undertook a project that cost over almost $130,000, basically again to benefit the fishery. This is the cast of characters. You can see some of them are kind of eclectic. They dye their goatee pink. He's still an okay fisherman. But this is the cast of characters that raise the money, care for the fishery. They get out involved. They plant plants, help to reseed some of the areas around that bridge construction, again, to keep the fishery fishing and help it produce big fish. So again, all this sort of comes around to, you take care of the habitat, you take care of the fish, and the fishing will take care of itself. There's a lot of ways that you as the anglers or the fishers can get involved. We will always probably see periods of fluctuations in trout populations. Some of those are uncontrollable, whether it's drought or floods. Some of those are controllable through habitat restoration or working in ways to help keep the habitat healthy. And if you do that, the trout populations are typically resilient enough where they will come back. And I'd just like to close on sort of the message that was touched on earlier, that don't forget about keeping the kids engaged. We have youth programs that our Trout Unlimited chapters are involved in. This is an example of an adopt a trout program where not only did our staff and the agencies want to understand trout movement in a river and figure out whether they were being entrained in irrigation canals or where they were going to spawn. So they wanted to learn about the biology of that fish, but they developed this into a program where they got the kids out, they got to help weigh and measure the fish, they actually got to give the fish names. Kids are pretty creative when they give fish names. And then as those fish were tracked, basically our staff went back into the classroom and used that information and brought out maps and used it as a life history lesson as to what's important to trout, why they need to move around in watersheds to spawn or overwinter, and just use it as a way to engage kids. We do a lot of things outdoors to teach them about stream health, what's important for juvenile rearing habitat, why a healthy aquatic invertebrate community is important. Our our local chapter actually does a youth camp where they bring kids up into the mountains and have a 2-day fly fishing camp where they teach kids how to fly fish, because these are our future fishers and they're the ones that are going to be involved, into the future. We want to bring them up with a conservation ethic, but we also want them to be able to fish. One of our other big programs is our Trout in the Classroom program, where our chapter will raise money to help put an aquarium and a chiller in a classroom. We're partnering with the local state agencies where they'll produce or donate eggs from a hatchery. The kids will raise them in a classroom, and the teachers will actually develop curriculum around, raising fish from eggs to fingerlings. Teach them about the biology and the needs of trout, healthy habitats, how restoration can play a role, and those fish will ultimately be released into the local water. So they'll get to see the fish go through the full life cycle up until they're about this big. So another good program that we do that's the teachers love it because they get not only free stuff, but it helps them tie in a bunch of fun aquatic ecology type lessons into their curriculum. So I'll end on that note with the kids. Thank you very much.
Authorised by Victorian Government, 1 Treasury Place, Melbourne.